Okay, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Sorry, everybody, for the technical issues that we've been having. So thank you for being patient with us. But I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Holly Irwin, and I am the Public Programs Specialist here at Dumbarton. And I just want to welcome everyone to the first part of our Preservation and Practice series. This series aims to promote increased training in trades, the business of historic preservation, the social responsibility of preservation, and how we can plan for future preservation endeavors. I also wanted to note that we will be recording this session and it'll be up on our YouTube page sometime next week. So I will be acting as a moderator for our two guest panelists. First, today we have Ariana Makau, who is the president and principal conservator of the Nzilani Glass Conservation. She has been a conservator for over 20 years, working at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, and her experience and expertise allows her to connect with a wide range of people, both in the conservation community and beyond, to show the value and relevance of art preservation. So we're really looking forward to hearing her unique perspective this afternoon. And secondly, Lindsay Jones is with us from the Blindeye Restoration as its owner and CEO. She has a passion for old buildings and public art and uses her business to help communities understand the influence of their local historic buildings, as well as many other things. So I just want to welcome Ariana and Lindsay. Thank you guys so much for being here this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I am going to pass the torch over to Ariana.
Great, thank you. First of all, caveat to everyone, I'm getting over a cold, so I might sound a little scraggly, but I'm so happy to be here with everyone. I am going to share my screen and give you a really quick overview of my company and how I came to do what I do. So, as was mentioned before, I had a pretty traditional track for conservation. I was a studio art undergrad major, then I went and received my master's degree in stained glass conservation from the Royal College of Art in London. And my family's always been really passionate about education. And so the day that I received my master's degree in stained glass conservation, my father, who's Kenyan, bestowed a gift on me, which was the name of his mother, Tabitha Nzilani Makau. And traditionally, you're given one name when you're born and another name when you come into your own, and your parents can decide when that happens at any time in your life. But he decided I'd chosen my profession and that it was time for me to receive the second name. So I chose, when I started my company, after working in museums, there's actually only a few, less than 5 full-time positions as stained glass conservators within the museum community. And so I worked at both of those places. So the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Met, as was mentioned, but whenever those positions came up, I was in literally another part of the world. So I thought I would form Nzilani as a way to serve museums and the community at large by having my own company. And there's my grandmother who lived to 103. May we all be so lucky. So the values of Nzilani, I really started from the beginning, but it was years later that I distilled them into these 3 concepts or 3 pillars, which were be safe, have fun, do excellent work. And I'm really passionate about it in that order because we work with lead-based materials, both actual lead and surrounding areas, lead-based paint. And I feel that if you're safe, then that goes on to feeling comfortable. So you're having fun, and we are also doing great work. Let's see if I can get this to go to the next. There we go. So in safety, as I mentioned before, specifically, we deal with lead in old leaded glass windows. And this is an example of us removing an old panel from a church. This is St. Vincent de Paul. in San Francisco, Century Glass, Carl Huneke stained glass windows. And we're in full PPE equipment because that's what you should wear if you want to keep your lead levels down, which means everyone is happy and we're not dispersing that into the environment. We also really have fun because we have such a unique and broad swath of different objects that we work with. So sometimes we're working on someone's family heirloom. It's a vase or a lampshade that someone accidentally broke, or it came to them broken, but it was their grandma's and they couldn't remember. Or they do remember what it looked like when it was together, and they're really happy we can put it together. And on the right, that's a piece worked on by the Getty. We also work in residential homes. So in San Francisco, there is a prolific amount of Victorian homes that have just plain windows on the bottom and then detailed windows on the top. And then monumental pieces, like I mentioned before. One of the things I'm most passionate about is the team of people who Nzilani has had the joy and pleasure of having work for us over close to 20 years in existence. And so we really, even though I came to conservation through a certain path, we find people through very diverse backgrounds. And when I say diverse, I'm not just talking about skin color, I'm talking about experience and interests. And I think it makes the company a lot stronger. A couple examples of that are, if I can get my PowerPoint to work. Okay, let's try this one more time. There we go. So here we are, the opening shot that we had for the whole introduction to this lecture was me suspended over this dome, and here we are installing it. So here are the examples. We have one person, Najah, who is a glass blower. We don't do glass blowing in-house, but she has provided us with custom glass for windows that we make for new residences, new pieces, and also if we're trying to color match, she brings that expertise to the table. Jesse is a mosaic artist outside of working for Nzilani, and so he's super, super precise at fine tuning, even if you have a sheet of glass, making sure that the shading works throughout. And here he is working on a lamp from scratch. Olivia is a leather worker. She came to us through an art school background. And she doesn't have an official or formal background in conservation, but she's extremely meticulous. She also does these beautiful line drawings in her own time as her art. And so she works really well at just concentrating and piecing together tiny little shards and really builds this relationship with the pieces of work that she does. And this is Stephen, who is soldering. He's a musician. And so his writing skills for his lyrics directly translate to writing condition reports. And definitely not least, but again, talking about diversity, we also are diverse in the different contractors that we pair with, and also in accepting different ages that work with Nzilani. So this is actually our building manager, who's also a carpenter and a fine photographer, and the list could go on, but he's sort of our patron saint of the studio. This is Al Wingard, and he just has a wealth of experience. He is self-described Reformed Amish, so that's his background, but he has just bestowed us with so much information, and we work with him when we're working on our woodworking projects. And so that dissemination of information from him is going on to multiple generations rather than just staying with him. And one of the things that I'm thinking on moving forward, and why I'm so excited about talking with Lindsay about this, is pairing up with different groups working on new work, and also how we can serve our community better here in Oakland. And I failed to mention that Nzilani is based here in Oakland, California, the unceded territories of mainly the Ohlone people. And so I think it's really important to not just work in a bubble and work on preservation of certain types of buildings, but bring in the people who currently live here in West Oakland and Oakland in general, and get them really excited and passionate about work. So this is a photographer who works with Tintype, Demetrius, and where he came in and gave a talk for the team. And now I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Lindsay.
All right. I did not come as prepared as Ariana today. I look like I'm got a wind machine on me because I am actually, it's the fall and we have like 8 deadlines and I actually have paintings drying around me right now, which I think anybody who's ever worked in the trades or had a house project and a contractor working on it in the fall, you're probably pretty aware of how just feeling like you're racing in the fall, that people are just all over the place. I've been in construction my whole life. I basically went to work with my dad when I was too old for daycare. And so I was handing him tools and reading Boxcar Children at the same time in my summers growing up. And when I went to school, my thought was, I don't want to do construction. I'm going to be an artist. And so I also have an undergraduate in the arts, although more art history, and then a fine arts minor. I ended up going and working, it was in 2008, I did AmeriCorps with Habitat for Humanity locally. And I had an experience where there was an intern who got an unpaid internship with Habitat, and I trained him. And the end of the summer, he was hired as my boss because he had a construction management degree, even though I had been doing the job and teaching him everything all summer. And so I was a little like, what the heck? I know what I'm doing. And I went to the undergraduate construction management program and went through that as well. It was really kind of an eye-opening experience for me as a person, because I feel like I got in there expecting to be overwhelmed. I mean, I wouldn't have told you this at the time, but probably expecting to be overwhelmed by the fact that it was 99% male dominated students, like 400 dudes and me in an auditorium. And yet we'd be in a studio framing course and we all had to put a couple of nails into a floor joist. And I would make either of the guys on either side of me nervous because I'd just get mine in a couple of swings and then they'd all bend them over. And it was a funny experience realizing that I knew how to do all of this stuff already. These guys were coming into this field that they kind of just felt, this is what we do, and didn't necessarily have to have the experience to feel like they belonged there. I, meanwhile, came in with already years of experience under my belt, really surprised myself at how well I did in a lot of the classes. Still found myself struggling a little bit in the career path. I didn't love new construction, and I obviously found there was a little bit of pushback with my presence. People didn't really know what to do with me. So I ended up learning about historic preservation as a master's degree program, just as I was finishing that undergraduate, and decided to go and get my master's degree. I really loved old buildings. I knew I liked construction, but maybe I was thinking this would be a good angle into getting into a different part of the field. And when I got there, realized that a lot of the historic preservation master degree programs are almost entirely paperwork and not a lot of hands-on, which honestly not that different from the construction management program. They put you through the paces so that you can say you've done it once, but they don't actually get you in there to the point where you feel like you could frame a house. Or in preservation's case, you don't necessarily feel like you could restore windows, even though that's such a big thing that the historic preservation field talks about. They all learn about the specifics, but they don't necessarily have the hands-on comfort with it. So went all the way through that program, learned a lot, honestly, probably more than my construction management program, and met some good people. But ended up, I think just the fact that I had a master's degree, it went further than I feel. I don't encourage people to get a master's degree just to get a master's degree, but it does have that purpose of getting you places sometimes. And it got me a position in San Francisco with an architecture restoration firm that was a sister company with construction or architecture firm, ARGCS. And in that position, they actually hired me as a construction manager for their conservation projects. So I could speak both to the architects and the preservationist side, as well as to the hands-on restoration side. And then they had one trained conservator on staff who obviously needed help. And when they found out that I had hand skills, I basically ended up getting a personalized apprenticeship with hands-on restoration through my friend. And we still talk, and I've great memories of being there, but San Francisco is very expensive. So I eventually moved back to Ohio. And as much as I would have liked to immediately have found that same kind of situation and found another company that I could, offer my services to, it really just didn't exist here. So I ended up working for a developer and a little while doing kind of my bridging the gap between preservation and construction. I'm the person all of a sudden. I'm realizing I've pigeonholed myself in this position where I can speak to the architects, I can speak to the preservationists, I can speak to the contractors, and I understand where everybody's coming from, and I can kind of translate. And through that job, I met some really great contacts and learned a little bit more about what was going on in my home state. Because when I left, I went to school in Oregon. I didn't know that there was hardly anything going on with preservation in Ohio. I'd met with one preservation consultant, and she almost pretty much told me, like, just get out, go somewhere else. The field here is almost non-existent. So I was pleasantly surprised that that wasn't quite the case when I came back. And it only took me maybe 2 years before I just was like, the resources are here that want to get this work done in terms of, we have tax credits, we have preservation nonprofits who are writing grants, we have the preservation architects, but there just weren't any preservation tradespeople. And I am not good at sitting at a desk. And I had just enough projects with the developer where I was the one hunting down contractors and not finding them and just feeling like I could do this, that I finally just did it. And I started Blindeye. The basis initially was window restoration because it's easy to jump into. Everybody has windows. It's a great resource to provide to people and know that you can potentially make a living off of pretty quickly. I shortly found that obviously I could cover my own expenses, but it's a lot easier having somebody help you. And thankfully, one more person adding extra labor isn't just taking money out of your pocket, it's helping you make more money. So once I realized that that was a thing, that the people who wanted to work for me could actually make money, essentially under the company, but for themselves. Like, I'm not just paying these people to show up out of my goodwill. But it got me into the groove of, oh, wow, there's so many more people like me who really want to do this kind of work. They really enjoy working with their hands. They really enjoy preservation, but they maybe just don't know how to get started, or they haven't seen this kind of opportunity before where they could learn preservation hand skills from a woman. And it's really sunk into me that representation matters. And I mean, we've all heard it. I think, in recent political elections, when there were women leading the polls, I was really starting to feel it. But I had never had that kind of woman mentor in my career that I looked to and was just like, oh, she does it, I can do it. I've kind of just pushed my way through and been frustrated and struggling the whole way. So being on my own and struggling as my own business felt natural, I guess, in a horrible kind of way. But I think it's really fantastic that I'm suddenly seeing, you know, all these women just come out of the woodwork and they're so excited about what I'm doing. It's not just construction is a man's field. It's construction of or repair of your home, or, you know, it's an extension of interior design and keeping things out of the landfill, and lots of different interests that come together in a way that has been kind of gatekept with construction and a male dominated career field. So with my position here, we have a largely female crew, and that's not because that it's the only people, well, I'm saying this wrong. It's not because I don't have options. Does that sound right? Anyway, it's all women. Women come and apply to me, and they're all excited and they want to learn. And honestly, nobody comes to me with window experience. I have to train everybody from the ground up. I don't care if there's a guy who's been in the trades as a painter for 10 years. He's not really much help to me if he doesn't know how to glaze a window properly, or can't do the basic carpentry, and we have to follow through and all the different steps anyway. Like, you have to start off on the ground floor with everybody else, and it's created this real position of equality in our crew where everybody starts out in the same place. Everybody moves up as they learn the skills, as we're working on projects together. And I love this so much, and I love teaching my crew. We've begun extending that. Well, we've been teaching basically since I've started having employees. We've taught through the local nonprofits in our area, and we've taught a couple of private classes, window workshops, things like that, and it just keeps getting better. This year, I've just started working with the local liberal arts is not right. It's the City of Columbus Public Schools, but it's an alternative high school where they have building arts trade classes. And so once a week for 2 hours, I am teaching a group of 18 kids about the restoration specifics of, you know, renovation. What is this that we have to pay attention to in historic buildings? And I'm just really getting a kick out of that, and I love teaching, and I'm excited to talk more about how we get more people into the trades today.
Well, thank you so much for introducing yourself to everybody. I could probably sit and ask you a million questions about your backgrounds, but we are going to dive right in. So we're starting off with a fairly large question. So, what is the responsibility of our society to preserve our historic buildings and infrastructure?
I can start off with that. I recently was talking to someone, and it's really prevalent. You know, Lindsay mentioned that the Bay Area is so expensive, and we're really seeing that in Oakland specifically, that there's a phrase which is horrible yet somewhat true, which is preservation through poverty. And what that means is that people don't have the funds to preserve or take care of their homes, and so they don't go through those reiterations of, you know, like the newest trends. So you see Victorian homes that have been in the same family for multiple generations here that are now starting to get into stages of disrepair where people choose not to live in them, or they're getting gentrified and forced out, or they're seeing, you know, how much their homes are valued and they can move somewhere else and, you know, take care of their extended family if they move elsewhere. But what's happening is that you're losing the culture with the people. There's this disconnect of house from home and house from history. And I really encourage people to think about when you're preserving a building, also finding out what the history of that building is, and finding out if there are ways where you can, preserve the oral history. If people have decided to, you can't tell anyone what to do with their homes, but I know, for example, we went and spoke to a woman who's a couple blocks from our house, and she had her grandparents' framed marriage certificate on the wall, and the roses that were in the front of her garden were from her parents who had moved into this house in the 30s. And it's an immaculate home, but she needed some windows restored a little bit. And first of all, didn't know there was anyone local who could do it. And second of all, was kind of straining with, the cost that was, that entailed. And thinking about someone like her, if she was forced to leave or decided to leave just because she didn't have the funding, I think that, private-public partnerships are really important in that type of preservation consideration. So not just thinking about like the building itself, but who's passed through that building, who's in that building now, who's that building going to be for in the future. If it's getting passed on to someone, you have all this rich history that needs to travel with it, as well as, just making sure it's safe.
Yeah, and I can expand on that a little bit too, in terms of cost and what happens when we, gentrify these buildings. We are seeing a lot of flips, if not just straight up demolitions. And while it's obviously sad and horrible to lose the fabric of our historic neighborhoods and the history there, it's also horrible for our environment. We're putting so much material into landfills every year. Flipping is, at least they're keeping the shell of the building. It saves a couple of tons from going into a landfill, and maintaining or bringing something that's, really fallen apart back up to a living standard in a historic restoration way can be very time consuming and expensive versus your basic flip. But the material that comes out, even in that, the plaster and lath that comes down, interior trim, doors get thrown out all the time just for not being perfect. And it's a really big factor in, our global warming issues, for the energy use. We don't think about the use of energy in the actual materials that we're buying and putting in and how it's been transported there. We only ever seem to talk about how energy efficient our buildings are. And instead of saying, a mothballed building is the most energy efficient thing there is, and maybe pay a little bit more attention to where you put the thermostat when you're calling out who's responsible for this, we want to take it out on the buildings, and we're just rolling over an issue and ignoring our responsibility in that. So that's my take.
Kind of hopping off or going off of that a little bit, how can we plan for preservation and longevity during new construction, or if somebody is undergoing, like you said, like a house flip, for example?
It can be tricky if you are not specifically aware of what is historic in your home. There are preservation consultants, either contracting related, nonprofit. Our local Columbus Landmarks actually comes out to people's homes for free just to consult and say, yes, this is historic, or that's a feature that you can have maintained, that kind of thing. Basically, in old houses, if you have an old original feature, they're usually built to be maintained. Paint surfaces, shellac, it was something that you could just buff up and recoat. Varnishes, buff and recoat. Paint coatings, obviously recoat. Wood windows are infinitely repairable. A brand new replacement window will cost you upwards of $1,500 for a regular 1/1. If we're looking at historic guidelines in specific neighborhoods, they'll be very particular about it, and you'll end up with the most expensive unit. Versus if you put a coat of paint on your original wood windows, that'll save you for 10 years. Granted, a full restoration of an old wood window, if you want to make it fully functioning and that fantastic sparkle and shine, it's about equal to a brand new window cost. But we're running into a thing here in Ohio specifically where we're kind of at that 150 year mark of a lot of our existing remaining historic infrastructure. So a lot of it needs full restoration because it's been ignored for so long. So it can be an issue, but when you look at it, it's still, there's always something to be repaired, and you don't have to do everything all at once. Is something else to remind people of when they live in an old house. It's kind of just going to be your lifestyle. Living in any house, honestly, like maintenance is going to be a thing, whether it's a new house or an old house. So keeping that in mind, not trying to take everything on all at once, and just living in the home and seeing how it wants to adapt and change and work with your family. No one's requiring that you keep all the original historic finishes from 5 families ago, but if you can keep them out of the landfill and make them more to your taste by just minor tweaks rather than fully ripping things out, that's always better than the full removal.
Yeah, I think the first thing is really just having a passion and interest in the home, even if it is a new home, like understanding the materials that the home is made out of, and understanding how you can preserve them. One of the things that we do when we're working with monumental buildings and also working with people in their homes is walking them through and pointing out details that they may not know. Recently, I went and looked at a home that had a few windows, and the owner said, I really like to sleep with the windows open when it's raining. I just love the sound. And I know it's not great for preservation, but I'm committed to restoring these frames because this is the lifestyle I want to have. And I've already had them redone once. And I guess you're going to have to get rid of all the glass, right? And I was incredulous. I was incredulous. I was like, why would you want to get rid of the glass? Oh, well, that's the last time I had these done 20 years ago. And it's a home from 1914, I believe. They just chucked out all the glass. So they threw out all the old original wavy glass because the rest of the house has it. And it's just standard, boring, in my opinion, clear glass. And so now when we're redoing the windows again, we're going to put in restoration grade glass. And now she's empowered and she just didn't know. And I think those are things that we come across all the time, that it's that famous saying, there are known knowns and there are unknown knowns, which I'm completely, messing up here. But I think that people don't know that they don't know about it. That it goes to a broader approach to how, if we're getting philosophical about it, that the society is so set to, like, you buy something mainly made out of plastic, it breaks, it doesn't cross your mind to figure out how you can fix it, because you can't fix plastic easily. You can't fuse it back together. You can't edge bond it. So why would you apply that to your home? Whereas you have these historic materials like wood and glass and even, lead, we can replace it. But keep all the other parts there. And I really liked what you said, Lindsay, about, it's not an all or nothing approach. And I think people sometimes feel daunted again by all these, home repair shows where it seems like 3 people do a repair in 30 minutes, which sort of implies that they did it in a week. And I want to know how many people are actually doing all the work. I think, lifting that veil and showing the group of people who are doing the restoration, preservation work and what those people look like and what their skill set is, and how internships are really paid internships are very important. And, you know, going back to the apprenticeship program, I think in the past people have thought about that as being passé, or, you know, that was in another generation. And I think it's so applicable to people now too, that you may have an amazing skill set and you just don't know that there's a profession out there for you.
Yeah, and contractors, modern contractors aren't actually, most people who go through the trade school, I mean, are not actually trained about historic methods. Kids going through school now will never learn how to glaze a window, or they'll maybe briefly talk about it, but like the really soft mortars and mixing lime mortars with old sun-baked bricks, and, you know, hand chiseling out the beds instead of using the grinders. It's not something that they're taught. They're taught in the post-industrial, fast as you can be in order to make the most money processes. They don't learn about these types of things. So it's, yeah, you don't know what you don't know sometimes. And you'd be surprised who doesn't know what they don't know. So don't just take anybody's word for it. Make sure that they are actually a preservation professional if you're looking for somebody that has that kind of knowledge that can help you with it.
Right. And I think on par with that is also valuing the preservation professional. This is something that we come up time and time again, that like you said, when you were going through this class, that people, it tends to be male dominated, and people just sort of assume, you know, I do construction, I should be able to, you know, make a living off of this, have these sets of benefits and paid, you know, there are unions, there's a set amount of what you should make per hour. And I'm not disputing that that is valuable, because it is very valuable and not everyone knows how to do that. Conversely, I have found sometimes when I go as a professional preservation professional who has all of that knowledge, and in addition to that, I have knowledge about preservation, and you start talking about what those costs are to do the very labor intensive, you know, nail instead of nail gun, you know, knowing, having all that history, people really balk at it. Like, oh, well, you're so passionate about history. Oh, you're an artist. For us, you know, the stained glass, and especially in the West Coast, has this perception of hippies making sun catchers in the 70s, which is great, but it's not what we do. And so there's this perception that we should be grateful to even have the work. And so they're trying to like negotiate back and forth. And you know, I would kind of push back and say, well, what if we were just having a conversation about a new window, or a new roof being put in? And sometimes the light bulb goes on and sometimes it doesn't. But I think changing the narrative of what our commitment is and our passion should equate to a monetary value, as well as just acknowledging that we're really passionate about these houses. I think also should draw in new people who are interested in the trades and want to do it, but also want to pay their rent or their mortgage, or contribute back into the community in other ways too.
So I have one last question for you guys, and it is, how is preservation responding to calls for diversity, equity, and access? You kind of touched up on it a little bit, but.
Right. Lindsay, if you want to go first, I'm having a coughing fit, sorry.
Okay. Well, I think something that's really great about preservation from the construction perspective is that we are, you know, breaking out of the mold of what construction was, because there's a lot more academics. There are a lot more artists. My crew, a lot like Ariana's, we have printmakers and painters and jewelry makers. I have a guy who's a farrier. I have a fellow who makes, most of my people come from art school. So there's a comic artist, and I I love how all of these people came to me, you know, they work with their hands, but they've not necessarily worked with their hands in this capacity. And they feel comfortable coming here and not necessarily being that cookie cutter type person that you would expect to see on a construction site. And at least from my perspective, in my particular niche of the field, I think that that's offering a lot of opportunity. And then from the advocacy, preservation, history side of things, I think we're able to focus on a lot of neighborhoods, places where, you know, history was made, and we're focusing a lot more on, you know, diverse audiences and Hispanic and Black. And my neighborhood, specifically where I am, has a fantastic history of being one of the strongest Black middle class neighborhoods in the country during the 40s and 50s, I believe. And then there was the highways that came in and just cut our neighborhoods up and destroyed everything. And we're documenting not just the history of what once was, but also the highways are still here and they're still causing problems. And it both highlights the history of, you know, different cultures, different people, as well as the issues that are still present, that are still affecting them. And so it balances where we've come from and also what we're still dealing with, and how a lot of these issues that, you know, we may or may not talk about in history class are actually still very present in our lives. And so it's really nice to be able to support our community. I think preservation is a lot of supporting your community too. And that just always, it feels good no matter what part of preservation you're a part of. I think we're all about community, which is really great.
Yeah, I think there's two parallel lines, which I would love to see cross over a little bit more. There's a lot of conservators who have gone along the conservation path who are trying to bring more diversity and access to groups of people who haven't had access to that before, and saying, well, let's give more access to museums, more access to training in conservation, which I think is great to widen that scope. Conversely, I think there's a greater acknowledgement of learned skill sets that didn't fall along the path of conservation, but are equally valuable. And again, I sort of tip my hat to Al, who he's turning 83 years young in a couple weeks and is still totally together, and is, you know, texting me at night, like, I found this great thing on YouTube, you should check it out. I mean, he's just a wealth of information. But, you know, all joking aside, the fact that there are younger people at Nzilani who are learning from him, both through oral history and, to your point earlier, Lindsay, literally working alongside him. They're not watching a YouTube video, they're not reading a book. They're engaging with him in his workspace. And you know, he'll be the last to say that he's a teacher, but he's an amazing teacher, because he doesn't say, I'm going to do this step and here's the next step and here's the next step. He'll say, we need to do this project. What do you think we should do? And sort of, you know, gives guidelines as to how to work on some of the woodworking or facilities of what we do. The other thing that I do for community engagement, which I think is so important, is starting young. So it's, those seeds are planted early and the roadblocks aren't so thick or high. So you know, Lindsay and I have been on a couple panels now, so forgive me if you've heard this trope before, but I use my children as Trojan horses, mainly because I can go and be like, you know, talk about what your parent does at work day at school. I've started since preschool that I'll go in and I tell them what I do and try to relate it to, you know, drawings and talk about the different people who work for me, and just the nature of me going there and saying, this is what I do, and you can do it too. The nature of representation, I think, is really, really important. Being a woman of color, I look like, sadly, I'm starting to look like their grandma now, but I like to think I look like their really cool aunt who does this kind of work. But all joking aside, if it's presented as this is a career path you can do, if you want to go to college, you can go to college and do that. If you want to apprentice with someone, you can go and find someone in the community. That there's not one clear path to get to preservation. There are multiple ways, and there's these multiple facets of resources that you can have within your community. I think that's a really great way to start people off, and not wait till people are struggling, figuring out like, well, I'm done with high school. Now what am I going to do? What's expected of me? And they end up getting in, even if they're interested in history, if they don't know about that as a resource, you're losing one more person who could be a career preservationist.
Yeah, preservation could be better about reaching out to younger generations. I think both of us are passionate about it, but I know a lot of people didn't find out about it until grad school, and not everybody can go and get a master's degree in order to work in the field, or you can't afford to come back and work for me after you've got a master's degree.
Right.
So it's important to also critique a little bit that we still are dealing with the history of old white gatekeeper kind of academic field, that we need to open it up a little bit more, and it has the potential. It's not always 100% there.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are going to transition, and there are some questions that people have put in the chat. And the first question, or one of them we want you guys to talk about, is from Karen. They're asking, how do you address popular materials that have a high R value, but are not recyclable, removable, and can hide moisture damage or mold?
I will say, just because I recently put on with Heritage Ohio a trades fair, where we had a old school slate roofer, and he got into talking about how everybody wants to insulate their roofs or their attics, and beyond it being terrible for the environment, a lot of these products, if you don't know what you're dealing with, it's very popular to use the spray foam, but it can very easily go bad and just like rot your roof off and cause major expensive problems down the road. The R value thing that I run into more often is when people want to use double pane glass, insulated panels, things like that. There are products out there that take up less space, but at the cost of having to replace your window units or modify them to the point of them being unusable, the expense, the weight of those gas-filled glass units, I don't think it's worthwhile. I think we need to pay more attention to what was used in the past and what are traditional methods of insulating the house were. I mean, we want to blame the window glass often. I mean, I talk windows because it's the easiest things. I always deal with them. The window glass, single pane glass is single pane glass. You can't hold it against it. It is what it is. It has a very low R value. It is glazing. If you want to make that better, you put a storm over it. If you still think that old windows are leaky, maybe look around the sides of your window, because if you use an infrared camera, often you'll find that your air gaps are coming from places that are not actually your window. It's maybe the siding around your window wasn't sealed properly. People's band boards around their foundations are so leaky all the time. Like, you go into houses and there's always just air flowing in around the foundation. And then for roofs, you've got your open cell versus closed cell foam. You've got your batt insulation. You've got loose blown in stuff. There's all sorts of things that when you have to consider the actual full life cycle of them and what they're going to do over 100 years of time in a house, is it actually going to be beneficial to everybody, or is it just beneficial to you in the first 5 years until it settles and does weird stuff and rots your roof? I don't know. I think people are mostly, they want to put stuff in because it's fast and popular, and they don't think through how the material is actually going to long-term affect the health of their building and the maintenance of it long-term, because having a building that's maintainable is actually social responsibility. I mean, if you provide something to somebody, like if you put in new vinyl windows, brand new vinyl windows, that's great. And you live in the house for 10 years, somebody else moves in 10 years down the road, they have to replace them. Now, instead of just putting paint on their old window or fixing a pane of glass, they have to spend the $1,500 for an entirely new window because there's no fixing that anymore. And I think that can kind of translate to a lot of things. And I know that's not a popular answer, and nobody wants to live in an actual old building the way that old buildings functioned and breathed. So I'm probably not going to win anybody over with it, but that's my mentality about it.
I know we're getting close to finishing up, and that was such a great overview of so many things, but I just wanted to talk specifically about leaded glass window and stained glass windows, and in reference to that. I know sometimes people think about the loss of heat through windows like that, and eventually they're all going to fail. That's just the way that's the nature of how they're built. And you can put, depends where you're from, what you call them, protective glazing or storm windows or another layer on the exterior to add a little bit of protection. And I just wanted to use this as a public service announcement that putting those on are great if you put them on properly. You just have to have ventilation, because if you just seal everything in there and you've got heat on the inside and cold on the outside, and your windows are expanding and contracting at different rates, and you're getting this moisture, like a nice little aquarium inside between your leaded art window and your plain sheet of glass, you're actually speeding up the degradation of your leaded art glass window. And it's, you know, if you're just talking aesthetics, it's not going to look great either. So again, it's good to talk to a professional who isn't just thinking about the art glass part of it. So that's something that we actually have a conversation every time we're going to look at a window with someone who hasn't had a lot of experience preserving them, and it might be part of a larger project. It sounds kind of weird, but you say, in your mind, where does your window end? Because you could get 10 different answers. You know, is it just the leaded art glass? Is it at the putty bevel? Is it with the sash? Is it the frame? Is it the wall? And like you were saying, Lindsay, like if your roof is leaky, it doesn't make sense for us to redo a whole window because the moisture is going to travel down, right? So windows are usually, our motto is first out, last in. But you have to sort of take the whole building in as its own entity and not just sort of, you know, jump around, because that's not, it's not long-term economically, it's not a good way to approach it. And yeah, I don't like vinyl windows either. So I'll come stand on your soapbox with you.
And the last question that we have is more of a technical one about how windows are preserved. So is new glass added or old glass?
If there is old glass, we try to preserve it at all costs, but it also is very brittle. And sometimes, you know, if it wasn't broken already, sometimes just the process of removing it from the window can sometimes happen. So there is always an option to put back in salvaged wavy glass, or there is reproduction wavy glass, or we can put in plain flat glass because it's available and affordable. But it doesn't change the R value. I don't think. I mean, it might, but like an infinitesimal amount.
Mm-hmm. And then for more art related glass that we do, we try to preserve as much of the original material as possible, even if it has multiple cracks in it, just because finding something that has the same color, translucency, texture as the original is really, really hard to find. It depends what it is, but you know, there's been a lot of movement in recent years with glass manufacturing closing down, or just they're still making glass, but they're not making glass that they were making 50, 100 years ago. So to make a really good color match is difficult, and it's really expensive. So it's not like you can just ask someone, send someone a shard and have them make, they can make a sheet, but in order to make that sheet, they have to fire up this huge kiln and maybe make 40 sheets for it to be viable for them to even sell it to you. So then you're sitting with this huge crate of, you know, how many, I don't even know how many square footage you would have for this one pane. But if you're working with an institution, it makes sense for you to do that, because then you have this stock of glass that if someone damages a window, or a window becomes damaged by weather or something else, then you can consistently have this glass stock for the next year. So it really depends. It's a case by case basis, right? The goal is always to preserve the original material, but if you're preserving it to the detriment of it functioning as a window, in our case, no one's going to care that you saved all this historic information, because the rest of your building is going to fail from that.
Well, it seems like our time is wrapping up. So I first want to thank Ariana and Lindsay for taking the time today to share your perspectives. We really appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone else who came to this panel today. We hope that you learned something new, or if you want to go restore a window, you know who to contact. And I want to remind everybody that there will be a next installment of the series on January 5th. Details are forthcoming, so just go to our website at dumbartonhouse.org/programs and keep an eye on that, as we will update you as information comes. But yeah, thank you everybody, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks again for having us, and it's lovely to see everybody again.
Yeah, it was a good time.
Yeah. See you in January. Bye.